Okay, a quick thought about Jung and his method of dream analysis. In my previous videos, sort of delineating the differences that I see between his method of dream analysis and Freud's, and one of the main differences that I could see was this way in which Jung seems to treat the dream as primary, whereas Freud treats the waking content that the dream is using as primary in a way, or that more than primary, it's that I think Freud conceives the process of analysis as a way to get at certain unconscious thoughts and emotions that you could potentially get at in any other way. So that, at least that's my reading of his interpretation of Dreams book, that you can do an ink blot test, for instance. Excuse me. You can do an ink blot test and use this sort of train of thought method, free association, without thinking too much about what you're saying and what you're associating. And this lack of thought that's been given to it leads one to discover hidden things. And you can discover these hidden things in waking life by using the ink blot test and other such methods, or by using dream analysis. But the dream analysis then is kind of like a complicated version of the ink blot test, because in the dream certain things have arranged themselves in an unconscious way, in a way that didn't have so much control put over them. And because of that, the form of control, the ego censorship that distorts the dream, is more extreme because it needs to control and suppress something that is much more spontaneous and unconscious. And so the censorship process itself becomes clearer. Anyway, that's kind of a digression. That's one aspect, I think, of Freud's thing. However, I think also that with Jung, it's not just that he's giving primacy to the dream as a place from which to draw one's analysis. I think another key element is that the dream itself includes information in Jung. Whereas in Freud, the information is all retrieved through suggestion, through association, I think. There's the ink blot test and there's the dream. And in both cases, you look at the phenomena, be it a complicated dream or a very simple ink blot, you look at it, and the first thing that comes to your head is already part of the network of unconscious contents that are being suggested by those dreams. Freud goes into this in his book in the fact that, for instance, he considers that if you are writing down a dream and you describe an aspect of the dream with a certain word, and then you think, no, that's not a good word, and you cross it out and you use a different word, that the word you crossed out has important information. It's the classic sort of Freudian slip thing, that even outside of the dream is at work. Even outside, there are ways in which the dream's meaning is being conveyed to you while you're awake. Because the dream is simply one other way in which unconscious contents can be visualized. However, I think that for Jung, there isn't so much meaning being applied to the process of analysis itself. In Freud, the process of analysis is where all the meaning is. Right? In this thing about the Freudian slip, right? If your analysis includes certain words, or you're tired while you're doing the analysis, all of that carries meaning. In Jung, the dream itself has information in it, and the analysis is more of a question of trying to perceive that information and relay it as clearly as possible. And this information, I think, for Jung, tends to be perceivable in terms of patterns, repeated images, or images that appear at differing levels of abstraction, and so on. Symbols, basically, so that Jung will look at a series of like 100 dreams, and if there is a hat in almost all of those dreams, he will take that and he will say, okay, the hat is an important symbol in these dreams. The hat is information that was in the dream. It was repeated throughout the dreams, the dream sequence, and therefore he kind of grabs that and puts it on a table and says, this is a symbol from within the dream. And then he will look at another set of symbols that associate, like, he will say, okay, in what kind of contexts does the hat appear? Well, I don't know, in this dream, the hat is on fire. And in this other dream, the hat is being struck by lightning. And in this other dream, the hat has a light bulb on it. And in this other dream, the hat has like red feathers coming out of it. And he will see that, well, fire, lightning, light bulb, there seems to be an association between the hat and the symbol for like fire, or light, or electricity, something that ignites the hat. And he will grab that and he will say, okay, well, this is something else that appears in the dream. Now, Freud wouldn't do this. He would never do this, I think, because I don't think Freud considers that there is information in the dream. First of all, whether there are many hats in the dream or not doesn't interest Freud, because it's not immediately relevant to the person. If you're looking at the dreams and seeing that there is a repeated pattern of hats, your first reaction is to say, well, what does that have to do with anything? What does that have to do with me? It's clearly a pattern, it's clearly perceivable, but it doesn't seem to have any relevance. So Freud discards that kind of stuff because he's centering on what does the hat bring up in my awareness. Well, when I look at the hat, I think of a banker or something, and it makes me think of money. And so the hat is associated to money, and so, you know, there is something about money that is being brought up in this dream. And even though that seems like a very relaxed way of analyzing something, it seems like it's not a very rigorous way of analyzing something. It's the kind of analysis that you would stereotypically associate to a conspiracy theorist that is a little too kind of detached from the left side of his brain or whatever. That's the way that I think people caricature Freud. But here, even though I'm also trying to defend Jung, I would also defend Freud in that it is rigorous in his own terms of analysis, because precisely what he's trying to do is to see what comes out. It's more that what Freud seems to have found in his patients and in his self is that often, if you say the first thing that comes to your mind, it seems arbitrary. It seems like you could have said anything else, right? It seems like, in the case of the hat, you could have associated to anything. You could have said, well, the hat reminds me of a machine I saw the other day, a computer, because that computer had like a sticker of a hat on it. Or it reminds me of a mountain, because a hat is round like a mountain, right? The criticism that is made of Freud is that you could associate the hat to anything, therefore, if you just grab one association and say, this is the meaning, it's arbitrary. But to say that is to miss the point. Because what Freud is trying to say is that the first thing that comes to mind is important. Now, the reason saying this is simply because of what he has observed in his clinical practice. It's not like an a priori prejudice that he's trying to bring. It's sort of that he has found that there is something about the unconscious that the first expression, the first thing that it says, seems to carry a much more high fidelity version of the content than subsequent iterations, subsequent corrections always try to hide it. If you say, no, it's not about bankers and money, it's about something else, then the very fact that you're trying to correct that and that you think that that's not a good association, the fact that you don't think that it's a good association already points to the possibility that there is something about this association that embarrasses you or that you're not too happy with. And precisely in that feeling of unhappiness, of disgust, is the unconscious and your sort of egoic relationship to it, the shadow. So for Freud, it has a lot more to do, ironically, with emotions, with following one's gut. In this aspect, it has a lot more to do with following one's gut. And Jung has much more to do with ignoring one's gut, in a sense, and focusing on just logical, sort of rational structures. Like, I see a bunch of hats in my dreams. Emotionally, I don't know how I feel about it. I don't really feel either good nor bad about it, but I see that it's there. And I say it's ironic because I think the way that Jung is caricatured in mainstream sort of culture is that he is kind of like the hippie spiritual one who has more to do with the emotions, and that Freud is kind of like a dry analytic one who has a clear structure that says that everything has to do with sex and this has to do with the penis, and that, in a sense, right, people interpret Freud as if Freud is kind of like the typical dream dictionary that says, you know, a tower is a penis and a sword is a this, when actually Freud is doing the opposite of that, is doing that there is no clear meaning to any of these symbols. It is the first emotion that comes to mind. If it's a good emotion, it signals that there is something about this that the ego is comfortable with. If it's a slightly negative emotion, it signals that there is something about this that the ego is not comfortable with. And he is just following these kind of feelings of comfort and discomfort. He's not so much following the actual information, but the feelings. And I think that there is something really interesting and important about that. The thing is that Jung, I feel, doesn't do that so much. Jung, obviously, yes, I mean, the fact that he's caricatured as this sort of spiritual hippie kind of psychologist is because he is, right? And I say this with all love, because that's sort of the good thing about Jung, that he is a psychologist that delves more into the realm of the spiritual and of the hippie, in the sense of everything being connected, everything being kind of love, and that's a simplification, but it does go more in that direction than Freud. But it's funny because it gets counterbalanced by this method of dream analysis, in which the dream carries information. You're not concerned about how you feel about the dream. Freud only wants to know how you feel about it. Jung is concerned about, what does the dream say? It's not what you're saying about the dream. What is the dream saying? And you detach yourself from it as much as you can. You say, okay, the dream is showing me images of hats, and it's showing me images of fire, and it's showing me images of this other thing, and altogether it seems to form a picture of this, of a hat on fire. So there seems to be some archetypal image of the top of the head being on fire or illuminated, right? And one doesn't sort of feel a direct connection to that. One doesn't think, oh, this really speaks to me. Usually what happens is that the dream is saying something that is alien, that is unconscious to you. And of course the reason why that is less popular than Freud is because precisely that's what Jung is saying, that the dream is saying something. Therefore, the dream has some sort of intelligence, some sort of an egoic structure, to call it that. There is some sort of a personality, or multiple personalities, that convey information to the ego. Or maybe you can see it, maybe all these are metaphors to try and explain it, but that at any rate, there seems to be a message in the dream. A message that is independent from one's analysis. And of course that doesn't sit well with our current cultural, philosophical axioms, I guess. One of which is that the ego is the only conscious, intelligent thing within the psyche. That there isn't anything more intelligent or more conscious than the ego within the psyche. And of course the other door it opens up, very clearly, is that these contents that appear in dreams, like this thing about the hat on fire, are clearly extremely resonant with images of world mythology, right? You could have these dreams of hat being on fire and be thinking like, what the hell does this mean? Or a crown of fire. And then maybe you have no idea, you have no clue about any kind of world mythology or religion, and you one day find out that in Buddhism or in Hinduism or in other mythologies there is precisely the image of, or in Christianity even, of the halo, of the crown chakra opening, of the head being sort of blown into flames through spiritual illumination. And you may find these images in mythology and say, well, it's pretty difficult to deny the fact that they have a semblance to the images that I was seeing in my dreams, right? If my dreams were constellating some sort of like through the multiple images, through the multiple dreams, a general archetypal image was being built, or a symbol of the top part of the head being on flames. And that seems to be an image that is very present in religion and mythology. So of course, that Jung is kind of delving into two dangerous areas at the same time. On the one hand, he's saying that the dream has a message to tell, independent of your analysis of it. And the second part is that that message that it is telling is not just personally catered to you, but that somehow it seems to share with the dreams of many different people in many different cultures. Right? If we consider mythology to be something that comes out of dreams in the sense that it is art that is being inspired by one's inner worlds and by the images that one sees in one's inner world, if mythology and religion could be described as being that in some sense, then yeah, he's kind of killing two birds with one stone, right? He's saying sort of the dream has a message to it, and that message is not individual, it's collective. There is something about the message that unites psyches together. So in a sense it's kind of like, yeah, it's impossible. In a way it's impossible for Jung to be accepted by culture. Right? I mean, there might be a way in which culture could integrate the Freudian perspective and the Jungian perspective. And of course that is in a way what I would want, personally, what I seem to be interested in happening. But at the same time, I also wonder whether what Jung is talking about is something that is so relevant to the inner world that it can't speak to a culture. It can only speak to the inner world. That is to say that Jung's insights, like the insights of religion and mythology, are insights that an individual must encounter. Right? That, therefore, maybe his insights aren't really insights that make sense at a cultural level, but that only make sense at an inner level. Whereas Freud's insights, because of, as Jung describes it, of a more sort of mechanistic way of seeing psychic phenomena, it fits with culture, which in itself is more mechanistic. And Jung, in the fact that he's seeing the psyche more in energetic terms, relates more to energy as in spirit, as in the inner world, the subjective world. So again, that's not to say, I'm not, like, I don't mean to say that this is some sort of, that Jung is just for a privileged few, that Jung is kind of like this closely guarded secret that only the privileged can access, and that it's not for the masses. No, it's that the very nature of the subject matter, that, or the insights that Jung is trying to bring up in the psyche, are insights that can't be easily shared with others. He is trying to share them, but he is, in a sense, he's trying to share them in the same way that mythology is trying to share things, in the same way that Buddhism is trying to share things. That is to say, yes, everyone knows about Carl Jung, he's a famous psychologist. Everyone knows about Buddhism and everyone knows about mythology. In this sense, they are cultural realities. They exist in culture and everyone knows about them. But as Buddhism says, for instance, Buddhism always uses these images of like the Buddha doesn't point directly at the moon, but points at like broken shards of glass on the floor that reflect the moon and stuff like that. That because the insight of the inner, of the experience of the inner world, can only be had by an inner world, that is to say by an individual, only the individual can have that insight. No one can communicate that insight to you. However, there are things that can be shared. Everyone can point towards a tree and look at it and say, look, that is the tree, and we are having collectively an experience of the tree. We are collectively experiencing the tree because it's an outer event. Yes, but if you are having a vision of a tree, a dream of a tree, you are the only one who can have that dream. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to think about, that maybe, you know, I always, there's a part of me that always tends to see Freud and Jung as representing kind of like almost these archetypal opposites that should be balanced out, that somehow in order for our culture to be healthy, it needs to balance this mechanistic side with the energetic side, the yin with the yang, and that somehow we should balance out an interest with the outer with an interest in the inner. And I still believe that, but I think that maybe there's like a play of words at play here. That culture can't have an experience of the inner. It can't have an interest of the inner. Culture can have an interest of the outer. But, how would I say, it's that individuals have experiences of the inner. And individuals form culture, individuals create culture. Culture comes from the inner. From our inner experiences we express things, and these things become culture, they form the cultural world. And then the cultural world enters again through into our inner world. So we hear other people's opinions, we see things, see buildings, architecture, food. It all comes in, and then it informs our inner world, it affects our inner world. So the outer and the inner are connected, right? This balancing of the yin and yang that I was saying, where I think that culture should like balance these two sides. Yes, it should balance them out, but it's easy to picture it as if both of these sides are things that exist in culture. So that, you know, there is an outer side to culture and an inner side to culture, and that the inner side is very weak, very feeble at the moment. The lunar side, let's say, the solar side is very strong and the lunar side is very feeble, and the lunar side should rise up and be balanced out with the solar. That is true, but the lunar side doesn't exist in culture. The lunar side is inner. It's a silly way of imagining it, but instead of looking at it as a horizontal balance like this, where my hands are on a plane in front of me, the solar and the lunar, maybe it's more like this. The lunar is here and the solar is here. The lunar is inside, the solar is inside. That it's a question of not balancing forces in culture as if the only playing field is culture. We are the playing field as well. We are the playing field together with culture. That the balancing of the inner and the outer involves us in connection to culture and culture in connection to us. That maybe it's more of an enriching of our inner world. Enriching as in like of reclaiming our inner world for ourselves. Not reclaiming it sort of for culture, but reclaiming it for ourselves. That if it is easy, I suppose, to get caught in culture in a way that makes you think that that your inner world isn't as real as the outer world, right? It is easy to feel that way. And I don't think this is necessarily an evil of culture. It's not necessarily, it could be, but it's not necessarily the fault. The blame doesn't fall on culture. I think that it's that culture is inherently external. And so everything in culture is external. And so we forget about the internal. I don't know whether we can blame culture and say, well, culture should balance out the external with the internal. Culture should show more of an internal side to it so that we don't forget it. I don't know. Maybe the culture can't do that. Maybe this is inherently an inner thing. I mean, maybe this was like the role of shamanism in certain cultures, and as Terence McKenna would say, especially of like hallucinogens and psychedelics, that psychedelics were an external substance which triggers an extremely intense inner experience. So in that way, there was a sort of interesting balance between the culture and the internal, that there was a cultural tradition which was a gateway towards inner experience. And I think that art also is that thinking, philosophy in general, is something that isolates you from the shared ideas and the shared feelings and brings you back in touch with your feelings and your ideas. But, so, yeah, I think that there is an inner quest at play here, that it's as if, yeah, culture by its very nature, if one is only has eyes for culture, one sees all these external things, all these mechanical things, and thinks, well, everything around me is like this, so I must be like this as well. So you adopt external ideas, you adopt external feelings, external philosophies. The whole external becomes the root from which the internal is rising under a certain view. You may think, well, the internal world isn't as real as the external. It isn't as important as the external. It's just an emanation that comes out of the external, out of the brain, for instance, or out of matter, in this one directional way. Whereas Jung, in going back to Jung, in using the imagery of alchemy, is trying to express this idea, and it's not, that's the funny thing, it's not Jung that's expressing this. Jung is simply translating and conveying, or the alchemists and mythology and religion are expressing images that belong to dreams. Of course, this seems like a dogmatic statement unless one really gets down and keeps a dream journal, or engages in some sort of an alchemical, shamanic inner practice in some way. Once you do find that there is a certain message being conveyed about, or at least, you know, that, let's say, in my experience, there has been a message conveyed of the conjunction of opposites, of this, which I think is why the alchemists were interested in this, and why so many religions and mythologies are interested in the conjunction of opposites. I mean, so many religions and mythologies are kind of about heaven and earth being connected. That's a conjunction of opposites, in a sense. The basic kind of religious premise of uniting the divine with that there has been kind of a split, a fall, and that it needs to be reunited, that these opposite experiences need to be reconnected, seems to be the central alchemical intuition. And what that says to me is that even though the world of culture says, you know, that the inner world comes out of neurons and out of the brain in this one-directional way, like everything goes from the material towards the internal, and therefore the internal is less real, it's subjugated to the external, that through an alchemical perspective and through an inner experience, one gets the experience via what one would usually consider a spiritual experience, or a psychotic experience, or a schizophrenic experience, or whatever it is, of synchronicity, even weird kind of, yeah, I mean, I use spiritual because I mean, there is a paranormal aspect, I think, to these kinds of extreme inner experiences involve, yeah, synchronicity, precognitive things, sort of, I don't know, weird forms of out-of-body phenomena, anything that's paranormal and esoteric, basically. That these kind of experiences, which are very subjective and very inner, that's why they can't be conveyed to culture. Culture will immediately mock them, are experiences that pose questions about the outer being the king and the ruler of the inner. In a sense, right, you can see it the other way around, that the outer only exists through the inner. You are having a subjective experience of the world. Now, of course, you can go in this other extreme direction, and that's where you go into the suffering of schizophrenia, let's say, the cause of suffering in schizophrenia, which tends to be that the inner world is perceived more strongly, more intensely, and in a much more real way than the outer. And therefore the body in one's external situation can't really function in the outer world, because it isn't, you know, all it can do kind of is resist the intensity of the inner world. The inner world becomes more real than the outer. So the alchemical, of course, and again I think that's the cause of a lot of the suffering involved in schizophrenia. Not necessarily because it's an intense experience, I think. I think that, for instance, you know, psychedelics are an intense inner experience, but it's an experience that that one goes through and then comes back from. And there seems to be an interesting body of evidence that psychiatrists like R.D. Laing talk about, of schizophrenic patients who recover from schizophrenia in a very similar way to how one would recover from a mushroom trip or a shamanic journey. There is something about the schizophrenic experience that has the character of a journey, and that if that journey gets interrupted, then you can stay in hell forever, right? Until the body dies. That there is something about, like in R.D. Laing's writings, that there is something about how we treat schizophrenia with the kind of sedatives, the kind of drugs that we give to schizophrenic patients, that in fact make it even more difficult for the schizophrenic to bear the experience. It makes the experience even more unbearable. Because ironically, a lot of the, it seems to me, at least, of course, R.D. Laing's books are from like the 60s, 70s, 80s, that a lot of these sedatives that were given to schizophrenics were given because the schizophrenic patient was like behaving uncontrollably and needed to be calmed down. But what happens when you calm down someone who is extremely immersed in the inner world? Well, calming means to relax the outer body, and it's an inward experience, right? If you become calm, you get sleepy and you go down into the dream world. A calming was exactly what they didn't need, in a sense. It drew them even more into the inner world. There is some interesting interviews in R.D. Laing's book and books with schizophrenic patients and people who had episodes of schizophrenia and then came back, who precisely relate that the sedatives and the drugs that were given to them made it even more difficult for them to coexist in this limbo state between the inner and the outer. So it seems as if, it's not necessarily a bad thing that inner experience be intense, right? In a shamanic sense, an intense inner experience is a journey, a voyage, an experience that one can go into. And so, to say, that we need to balance out the external with the internal doesn't necessarily mean that inner experience should be less intense than that of the schizophrenic. It simply means that the inner experience is not seen as the ontological base of reality, in the same way that culture in the external world isn't seen as the ontological base of reality. If one sees them in an alchemical way, if one sees them in conjunction with each other, that the inner is connected to the outer and the outer to the inner, then they can both be as intense or as light as they want at any given time. Outer experience can be very intense. You can be sort of, a lion can be chasing you in the jungle. That's an intense outer experience. Or you can have an intense inner, extremely sort of psychedelic vision. But at other times you might not. At other times you might have a very calm inner life or a very calm outer life. It doesn't, balancing them out doesn't mean balancing out the quality of them, but simply the ontological status of each. And that's the funny thing, that this balancing out involves us. It involves each one of us, the individual, the subject, right? Yes, there is a cultural dimension to this, right? You can say that it would be good if we had more movies that were, it would be good if not all blockbuster movies were, I don't know, it's not necessarily my opinion, but let's say there's a common opinion of people saying that, I wish blockbuster movies weren't so violent, or they were a little more introverted, not so, not so aggressive, or whatever. And that would be an interesting way of balancing out the lunar and the solar in the outer world, to actually produce culture that balances out the existing culture. But then again, that is simply, in a sense, a side effect of the inner, because one would make a movie or a piece of art from one's inner experience, and in order for that piece of art to be a piece of art that is more lunar than solar, then one has to have gone through an experience of alienating oneself from the solar aspects of culture into an inner lunar aspect. So it involves this sort of vision quest at some level. And I think that is the central task, the central balancing point, balanced out with the act of expressing oneself and creating art, but that there is, yes, you can balance out the external world like that, saying, you know, I'll add a little bit more of this to the movie scene and subtract a bit of that to the movie scene. So we balance out the way the movie world works, or the way the artistic world presents itself. But I think that if that is seen as central, then one misses the point of the fact that the lunar is the internal, in my opinion, and the solar is the external. So that the balancing between the two is not a balancing of the content of movies and the content of the cultural world, but a balance between the cultural world and oneself. Then that will have effects. That's the thing, that will have effects on culture, that would have effects, right? The way we treat the environment, the way that that politics and conflict exist or work. Yes, it seems to me that it would very likely change the world. Not in, I don't mean this in some big apocalyptic sense necessarily, but just that it seems clear that culture is affected by changes in one's inner world, right? If a huge change comes over the inner experiences of people, like in a time of war, everyone is hungry, everyone is afraid, everyone is angry. These feelings of anger and fear are internal, they're internal experiences that people are having, and they will create a certain kind of art, a certain kind of music, a certain kind of architecture. The world would be shaped in a culture that is being produced by a certain kind of inner world. Right? That seems to be the case. So that, yes, a change in relationship between the balance of the inner and the outer would create a different kind of cultural world. But that's how the cultural world would change, in my opinion. I don't think that it's a question of directly going towards the cultural world and moulding it and shaping it to our liking, because that will always be an egoic liking. It's what the ego wants the cultural world to be. But the shaping of the cultural world isn't up to the ego, it's up to the self. It's up to the psyche. And so it doesn't depend on what you do to culture, but more sort of, in a sense, the only thing the ego can do is kind of, well, there are many things the ego can do, but in this case of like inner journeying, it's more a question of following one's heart. And the heart is, I think, connected to more of a self, in Jungian terms, which is this balance between the opposites, this balance between the outer and the inner, and the inner and the outer. That's why the self is characterized as a mandala, because it's a balance, a circle. And that is where, like, change in the world would occur, I think, as an effect of rebalancing the ontological statuses of the inner and the outer. Yeah, anyway, that's about it. Thanks for watching.